So, welcome everybody to our final event of our very first International Women's Day Symposium. Perhaps you've joined us for panels 1, 2, and 3, but here we're having a more sort of relaxed conversation with the novelist and editor Angie Cruz. So just to give you a bit of background, her latest novel, Dominicana, is the inaugural book pick for the GMA Book Club and was chosen as the 2019-2020 Word Uptown Reads. It was shortlisted for the Women's Prize, longlisted for the Andrew Carnegie Medals for Excellence in Fiction, the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and amongst other shortlisted places as well. It was named the most anticipated and best book in 2019 by Time, Newsweek, People, Oprah Magazine, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Esquire. And she is also the author of 2 other novels, Soledad and Let It Rain Coffee, and is the recipient of numerous fellowships and residencies, including the Lighthouse Fellowship, the Siena Art Institute, and the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute Fellowship. She's published shorter works in the Paris Review, VQR, Callaloo, Gulf Coast, and other journals. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of the award-winning literary journal Asterix, and she's an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And we are absolutely delighted to have her here with us on International Women's Day in conversation. So, hi, Angie.
So happy to be here.
Thank you for being with us here today. So, without further ado, I'll just say if you do want to give questions to Angie, just put them in the Q&A function, and I will be dipping into them. So you can start now, and we'll keep that open. And I'll just give us a few questions to kick us off. So, your 3 novels all feature female protagonists, and in the case of Soledad, I would venture to say are very much female-led. What has drawn you to exploring women's stories in particular?
Thank you for that question. First, I'm delighted that Soledad has been reissued in the UK this year. In many ways, it was published in the United States in 2001.
Mm-hmm.
And when I wrote that book, I was very interested in writing, yes, the stories of women, but also the stories of a community.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, when I think about it being woman-led, I'm always surprised, right? Because one of the things, it is woman-led and it's women-centered. But what I find is that being that I am a storyteller, right? And I am the protagonist of my own life.
Sure.
I'm deeply interested in the ways that women move in their lives, the questions that they're trying to answer, the work that they're doing. And I guess what propels, and this could be initially unconsciously, but now very consciously, right? Since I've been writing for 20 years. What compels me to write about women is the erasure of stories about working class women, period, from all cultures. Latinx women, for sure, right? That the depictions of Latinx women as protagonists in any mainstream movie or TV show or book is rare. And when represented, they're always represented as side characters or girlfriends or wives, which is also a problem in general for all women, being that today is International Women's Day. But in particular for Latinx women, the ways that we're programmed to think of women, Latinx women, is to think of them as housekeepers or servants, basically, to other people. And so when I'm writing, I think, like, for me, because that is not my reality, right? I see the full complexity of what it means to be a woman, a Latinx woman, etc. I write about them. And I do feel that I'm a writer that is very focused on the omissions and the things that are not being said, the things that we're even afraid to say about ourselves. So, I think that Soledad, in a lot of ways, and it continues with Dominicana. If you look at these books that I've written, Soledad deals with a woman who is basically dealing with the trauma of domestic violence.
Sure.
right? And even though the main character Soledad is the one that is driving that story, she also is impacted by the trauma of her mother and her experience around domestic violence. And now I've written Dominicana, which goes to the beginning or the seed of that or that experience. So yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the crucial thing is that women's stories or female protagonists, they don't exist in a bubble, and they are impacted by sort of like other women's stories. And so, but that often doesn't get translated to literature or in film. And it's sort of like, okay, there's a side character there, but it's not kind of showing the fullness of that person's experience, right?
Definitely.
You were right at the end of Dominicana that it was inspired by your mother's story. What was it like weaving together that initial inspiration with the creative fictitious elements? Did you feel any like anxiety or insecurity pursuing the writing of that novel because of how close to home it was?
Well, I have since we're on Soledad. So when I wrote Soledad, you know how books have a description of what the book is about in the back? So when this book came out, it was my first book. I was in my late 20s. And I remember my mother saw the book and she said, who are these? No, she said, oh, you wrote about us? Is this about us? And I was like, no, mommy, it isn't. And then she read the book. She goes, who are these people? And why aren't you writing about us? Are we not interesting? So it flipped, right? First she was mad, and then she was wondering why I hadn't tackled the story of the family, whatever the family is. Now, the story of the family to me is, my mother, like many women in Dominican Republic, I just looked up the statistics, still 36% of women in Dominican Republic are married before the age or forced into a union before the age of 18. And they just officially banned child brides. But this is not just a problem in Dominican Republic. It's a problem everywhere. And yet, when I would ask my mother, who was married off at the age of 15 to a man twice her age, for, some hope of financial stability or progress, whatever we call progress, she would say, oh, it happens to everyone. It's a typical story. Like, you don't want to know about that, right? But what I didn't, I said, yes, I do want to know, because it's not something that we're talking about ever. We're not talking about what it looks like for a person not to have the agency to choose who to marry and why. And not only because she's being forced into it through family, but also because we have so much systemic barriers for women to live sovereign lives all over the world, right? So when I said to my mother, I want to tell the story, she's like, what are you going to say? Like, she's like, there's nothing to tell. She would not talk, right? So what I had to do was that I started talking to many, many different women that, and asked them, what was your arrival story? What was it like when you got to New York City? And in fact, the reason I didn't have the kind of maybe ethical or emotional barriers that someone would who's trying to write a story about their mother was because I moved the story to the 60s. My family actually didn't arrive to the United States in the 70s. I moved it to the 60s, and that required a lot of research. So what I end up doing is trying to talk to anyone who would talk to me, because in the official archives, there was very little documentation on Dominican women in New York City in the 60s, which makes sense. Most working class people are not documented, right? People who are documented in archives, and I know that there was some discussion on archives today, are people in positions of power, right? Who has the power to tell the story, right? So what I had to do is build my own personal archive of stories through interviews and going into people's photo albums and asking them, what was it like for you? How much did you get paid? What were some spaces, that felt like home to you? What were some spaces where you felt estranged? And it was a very joyful experience, because what I realized, especially with elders, we live in such an ageist society. they just were delighted to go back and share some of these, like I went dancing on 155th Street. They would, that used to be, back then, and I was able to get really interesting minutia of everyday life, or kind of like things that could only be documented through a receipt, maybe, because these businesses would come and go and the neighborhood was changing so quickly. And again, because so much is not spoken, right? It's just, you just live it, And so talking, like building the archive and researching suddenly took my mother's arrival story, which was, she was, on a very simple way, we could say, oh, she was proposed to by my father and married off and came to America in the 1970s. Suddenly now I'm writing about 1965, which was a really interesting moment in New York City in particular, and maybe the world, if I go deeply and look at what's happening in the world. But in 1965 in New York City, in the area that I grew up in, it was like at like the insurgence of the civil rights movement. It was like the assassination of a major African-American figure, Malcolm X. And the United States was also occupying Dominican Republic at the time, afraid of communism, right? So once you start doing that, bringing in everything you could only bring, I think, as an outsider almost, right? Like a synthesis of everything I read and saw, and newspaper clippings. I know you work with looking at newspapers. I looked at a lot of newspapers and looked at what is not being said here. Like, what am I going to bring into this based on the stories I've heard? Once I wrote the book and my mother read it, right? I give it to my mother and she says something really interesting. She goes, this was not my experience because I don't remember. She doesn't really remember anything before the age of 12 or 13. She says, I don't remember a lot, but it's almost like you gave me memories that feel true to me. And she felt very sane. Like she said, I didn't realize you were paying attention.
That's must be a fantastic comment for you as a writer to have that kind of feedback.
I get emotional every time. I was like, oh my God. Like, so it is a Valentine to my mother. It's a Valentine to women like my mother who basically go through their lives feeling invisible, right? Like, one, they're not being documented. So there's no reflection back to this experience as being significant, but also like literally move in the world doing what they do with very little affirmation or validation, right? Of the things that they're doing. So for me, like writing it was really like, now I understand. I said, oh, right. Like she probably thought that when I went off to college and that I wasn't really paying attention to anything she was saying. And in fact, I was paying a lot of attention. And this was really important for her.
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, I guess from what you said, then setting it in that sort of like, in sort of like a previous time period and in a time period that was slightly different to your mother's story, it must have been a bit of a help. And do you think, looking more broadly at sort of how we depict women's issues, having that space and time and thinking about where we've come since, is that also helpful in that way, do you think?
Yeah, I met with some, many people, and and I'm really glad to talk about this book today in particular, right? Because International Women's Day is really around, I think motivated by the silencing of women being, in domestic violence situations and abuse and pay equity, and all these issues are issues that show up in the novel. And I think that, there was I met no one. Everyone wants to talk about immigration, which I think is a really important issue to speak about because we're all dealing with it all over the world in a different way.
Definitely.
And what does it mean when you have different people with different cultures in one space? And I think that's really important. But the thing that most people don't want to talk about is surviving abuse. Like how to, what is going on that so many women, all classes, all cultures, are still struggling with not being believed, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And they are raped, when they're being molested, all of these different things. And I met with a high school class very recently. It was the first time it came up in a public setting, where this young woman said to me, were those scenes that you wrote where Anna's getting raped as hard to write as they were to read?
Yeah, I mean, when I read it, it was sort of like, it is graphic, but it needs to be graphic in a sense to kind of, because it is a horrific event and you can't really shy away from that. And like you said, it's filling in an absence in a sense of, it's not been kind of talked about. So.
Right. So when I wrote it, right, and I thought, when you were saying like, being now, the possibility of writing that story that happened then and continues to happen, I couldn't have written those scenes even 5 years ago. So I do think the movement, I'm so grateful for these movements like Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the protests that have been happening in Chile, and that sort of like, like a domino effect affected like the whole world, where women are actually claiming a space, protesting about the system that allows for femicides, that allows for these very violent situations that women keep finding themselves in, is that I could not have written this book without those movements.
Definitely.
Because what those movements have done is that we have all these young people vocally, things that could have never happened. Even I don't even imagine saying 10 years ago in a public setting, I am a survivor of rape or assault. I would have never said it, right? And now I could say it without shame.
Yeah, I think it's far more acceptable, and people are almost encouraged to speak their truth rather than the sort of like just swallow it and sort of like hide it down deep below. And that is very much a current thing. As you said, even 5 years ago, I don't think we were at that stage. I think it's interesting how, the specificities of stories are sort of, I think in this day and age, are starting to be allowed to flourish. And I've got a question here in the chat that says, what was the most interesting detail or story you found when uncovering women's arrival stories as part of your research for Dominicana? Which I think is quite interesting, linked to that kind of specificity thing.
Well, what I was always surprised. So for those of you who don't know, I built an Instagram archive where people could upload, like send me photographs with their arrival stories, and it's called Dominicanas New York City. And that's been really great. And some of those people who have submitted are also people that I spent some time talking to and looking through their albums. But the things that always surprise me are the little things that you would never know unless you have a conversation with someone in their kitchen over coffee, which is like, one woman, for example, said to me that her least favorite part of the day was lunchtime. Okay. And I said, why? She goes, weekends and lunchtime. I hate those days. In fact, she never took sick days. And she said, because those moments when she ate lunch or anytime she had time off, it was when the pain of missing her family and being alone in New York was just, she's like, I didn't think I could survive those 30 minutes. I was so sad. As long as I was working, I could put it aside. And I said, we forget like these things, our privilege is like, oh, we can't wait for lunch. We'll go for a cocktail, or.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of like the leisure time, that's the bit you're looking forward to in the day, right?
For the weekend. But imagine one, not having the resources or the money to go out and do those things. And also like that those moments are the moments where you understand what you're missing. The things that are really valuable to you, which could be your family, or what it means to sit and eat with the same people every day. And that's something that I discovered that was very powerful for me. So then it helped me change some of my questions, because I realized, oh, that's also part of the difficulty of being in a new place by yourself. Yeah.
Definitely. We've also, I mean, talking to sort of these individual women and learning their stories seems to be very much part of your research process. And we've got a question in the chat saying that I really enjoyed reading Dominicana. Could you please tell us a little bit more about that research process? So was it, I guess, was it mostly focused on these individual interviews, or what you said about sort of questions you had previously? Did you have sort of like a list of things that you wanted answered? What was going through your head in that kind of process?
Well, I think that, first of all, a novel is really like, once you have a character, it's like you're trying to keep up with the character, right? So the character itself drives the book. And once I understood Anna's 15 and, this is what's going to happen, and I actually wrote a draft of this book in the 70s because I was like, I know more about the 70s. But then I had to reframe it in the 60s. Once I ran off with that character, then I was like, wait, I don't know anything about this world. I can't take for granted, because I do feel like I'm a writer of place. This is my third novel. I'm going on to my fourth novel set in New York City and Washington Heights. I feel like, wait, what did it look like? What did it look like for a community like Dominican community where they have a very complicated and disturbing history with race due to the Trujillo dictatorship that basically tried to erase, that they were part of the story of slavery and all of these things, and created a huge anti-Haitian movement there. I was like, what could it have looked like for a Dominican to arrive to Washington Heights, that's really right there next to Harlem, during this moment of Black emancipation, or the fight for Black emancipation, and also be in this other situation where they're here as immigrants, they don't speak the language. So it required looking. Right? Like I had to learn about what happened in the civil rights movement. And that in the end was about making the space real, like this architecture real, the neighborhood real in that space, in that time period, which I've never lived.
Yeah. You mentioned about the language, sort of like the not coming from Dominican Republic and sort of not knowing it, not knowing English. And I think language in your novels kind of play a really interesting kind of role. Being from a family of immigrants myself, I know firsthand how slippery and malleable the idea of language can be when you're in the midst of more than one culture. And I found it really interesting. And it resonated with me how you incorporated both English and Spanish into your work. And I think in particular with Soledad, you've got sentences that contain snippets of Spanish, but then go into English, and bits that are translated and bits that aren't. And that kind of, it felt like a more sort of authentic way of presenting a multicultural, sort of like generational setting and family that has access to these two different languages and two different worlds. So I'd be interested to hear more about how language factors into the process of your writing.
I do think a lot about language. My only academic language is English, and I would never try to write in Spanish. But as you said, slippery and malleable is correct, right? So for most of my life, I moved in and out of English and Spanish in my family home setting. But in my world setting, it was mostly English.
Right.
Writing this particular world, I understood that there's just some words that are not translatable, right?
Yeah.
But for Dominicana, for example, because the character Ana only speaks in Spanish, right? I had to really think about syntactically, how could I write the language so everyone understands that the Spanish is underneath the English. And that was, sometimes I would write scenes in Spanish and translate them back, thinking about where were the interesting moments in the rearrangement of words to make those sentences have that texture, right? Yeah, so it depends, you know. I'm always playing with that and thinking about how to lean in it, lean to that space of possibility, that being bilingual. I'm actually trilingual now because I speak Italian, and raising a trilingual child. Like, what are the possibilities that could happen? When, like, instead of seeing it as a detriment, to see it as like a gift, a power.
Yeah, it's a creative space. And, you know, like you said, there are some things that just aren't translatable. And if you try to go about translating them, almost they kind of lose their power in a sense. I'm just heading back to the chat. And there is one about a practical question about the nature of writing itself. In particular, I have a question about omission, which is such an interesting word as far as writing is concerned. When you write your works and rewrite them in the editing process, how do you decide what stays in and what doesn't? Is this generally a hard thing to do?
You know, if one of the, you know, I teach writing, and one of the things in initial drafts is that often we explain the thing that is already being conveyed through showing, right? Because we somehow believe that the way we told it or showed it does not actually, it's like the reader's not going to get it. So we'll have to then remind them, you know, so I think that for me, like in my early drafts, I write too much. Like I'll say it a million different ways, you know, like, she's suffering, she's upset. You know? And then, you know, part of the excavation is trusting that the images I offer, the situations I put her in, like, already convey the thing that I'm trying to explain. So I try to pull out all the explanations, and so that's how I decide. But, you know, in revision too, I mean, I think that's, sometimes this question is about real estate. It sounds like a craft question.
Yeah, I think
I'm
so.
answering it as a craft question because I think this is a writer that's asking me this question. In real estate of fiction, like, where do you spend time on what? It's always a big question. It's like, do I spend an hour on the setting, you know, like 20 pages on the setting, or do I spend 5 on the dialogue, like, or whatever? Really, it's about like, I think about movement. So really one great example is, like, let's say a character is running around getting ready to leave her house. That character is not looking at the setting because she's running around getting ready to look at her house. So
it's
the thing,
blur, right?
Yeah, she would be like, quick, doing the things she's going to do. The sentences will be shorter. But let's say she's stuck in her house, and there's a lot of that in Anna, in her story, Anna, then suddenly the space and the setting become really important because she actually has time to listen to the coffee percolate. The reason you could hear it is because you actually have time. Because if you're running around, that might not be the thing that you're going to be focused on. You're going to be looking for the keys. And that's how you know what's important, is basically what the character's doing. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. You know, I think the idea of being far more aware of your surroundings simply because you're forced to be there in a sense really comes through in Dominicana. Let's have another question from the chat. This is a good one. I think what you do is particularly important, but in terms of feminism, do you think the creative arts allow for more identification and empathy with engaging with and understanding people that are underrepresented and oppressed? And what are the biggest obstacles to this?
Do I think the creative arts allow for more empathy? You know, there was a few years ago, there was a lot of writing around fiction. Reading fiction allows for more empathy, right? And now there's a pushback on what they call the empathy industrial complex, right? Where a lot of people in academia are talking about the empathy industrial complex. Like, who are we writing for and what, right? So in some ways, I think that it's really powerful when you read a book that's outside of your experience and you suddenly feel more empathetic. Maybe reading Dominicana will make you think now every time, because maybe this is the first time you've ever come across in an intimate way, which is what books do, with someone like Anna, right? And suddenly you're like, oh my God, I had no idea someone would have gone through so much of this experience, right? And this is the problem when there's not enough stories being told about certain groups, because suddenly now, maybe that single story is the only story that you will read, and you will assume that every time you meet someone that you think fits the characteristics of Anna to have had an experience like Anna, which is not true, right? That's an assumption. And it happens because there's not enough representation, right? But I do think that there's also something about empathy, or this need to write stories so people could become empathetic, that's problematic, because I don't really need anyone in my writing process. I think it's great if you feel more, but it's not about healing. It's about if the feeling more propels you to do change, systemic change, give up privilege, share your resources, whatever it is that you need to do, then great. But what is found is that empathy is like, oh, I now feel better because I understand more, but it doesn't actually equate change.
No.
So, and some people are now arguing that this de-escalates rage, and rage could be rage or anger, and I love Audre Lorde. I don't know if you've read Audre Lorde.
Yeah.
Audre Lorde, when she talks about the uses of anger, how useful it is, because it hones in on what you need to fight for, right? And if we suddenly go into that space where we're like, oh, I think I understand what's happening, and put our hand back and start getting comfortable, that doesn't really happen.
Yeah, you need that thing to propel you.
Right. So I think like what excites me the most about what's happening now in fiction and the pushback around like empathy and who are we writing for, to be empathetic to what? I have empathy already for my people. I'm not writing for my people. I'm writing for my people, right? And what I want is, if anyone on the outside to be kind of outraged in some ways. My book, this particular book, Dominicana, was rejected for 4 years because they said there was no market. And I think this is an important thing to say, because one editor in particular, she said, I read the book and I want to throw it against the wall. It pissed me off. And what she wanted me to do was to change the ending.
Right.
So she's like, you take me on this ride. I feel so much for her, but I need to know she's going to be okay.
But that doesn't happen in everyday life.
Right. But the expectation of the reader outside of the experience, think about it, is like, I want to close the book. I know things are bad, but I want to know that they're going to find a way to be okay. But actually, no. The ways that things change is when all of us figure out in our spheres of influence how to make sure that we are all okay. That's how it happens. So the upset or the ambiguous ending of not really knowing if Anna will be okay, I think is very useful, right?
Yeah, it acts as sort of like almost like a launching pad of like, okay, we've ended Anna's story here. What are you going to do about it, right?
And I think that makes change.
Yeah,
it's not so much empathy, but like the place of, if you can get a reader to be like, is she gonna be okay? Wait, let me look up. Wait, it doesn't sound like the laws for immigrants are very good right now. What role am I playing into that? You know what I mean? That kind of.
Yeah, it's sort of like, literature, I think, and art is all well and good in itself, and it can be enjoyed in and of itself, but it is what you kind of take away from that once you close the page or once you leave the gallery, if it's visual art. That
right.
kind of, that's where the interesting stuff happens, right?
Right.
We've got another question here about, since we're on Dominicana, someone has said, I notice you have a traditional Dominican women's figurine in your background. Is there a significance to these being faceless?
Yes. They're called Dominicanas. and the book is called Dominicana.
Yep.
And they say that I don't know, this could be hearsay, but they say that the doll has no face because Dominican women look like all women. Like you can look, because of the history of colonialization and could look like all women. So the faceless is representing all the women in Dominican Republic.
Oh, that's really cool. And talking about women and women's bodies, someone has asked, I thought it was really interesting that you didn't shy away from the physicality of pregnancy in Dominicana, as so many novels do. Why was it important for you to write this aspect of Anna's story?
It took me 10 years to write this book, and part of those years I actually was pregnant. So initial drafts didn't, but one thing that happens when you have an experience, right? Like you suddenly become super aware of the impact. So I was like, oh, she's pregnant. Like being pregnant is a thing, right? Like going through menopause is a thing. Like all these things are a thing. Like teenage hormones, it's a thing, And sometimes you'll read and you're like, wait, why is no one really bringing up the physical challenges or changes that are happening in a lot of literature? Like they're in love. And you're just like, wait, but like, what else is happening? Everydayness. And again, I think it's because the body in general, again, was a taboo subject, right? Like sex was a taboo subject. The erotic in literature is a taboo subject. So I think that the explicit erotic, or, writing an assault scene, right, is a scary space in literature. So for me, it was actually that I experienced pregnancy and I was like, wow, like this is a big deal for me. And I think that it would be a big deal for Anna. Right?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I loved about the sort of like the characterization of her as a pregnant woman is that she's pregnant, but it doesn't stop her from doing other things. So she is still very much, cleaning the house or rocking out to the Rolling Stones or going dancing. And this is all happening whilst she is in this bodily state. And I think often when people write pregnancy, there is a tendency to forget about all this other stuff. And it is just focused on sort of, she's pregnant. And I think that kind of, for me at least, made it more authentic in that kind of rendering. I mean, I've obviously never been pregnant, but, a pregnant woman is still a human being. So she will still have other human things in her life, right?
Well, yeah, I think that there is like, and what is this investment in compartmentalizing the body or a person in a particular narrative? I mean, I always make fun with friends where we're talking about, when you see characters like on TV, you're like, it's like they have no family. Where are their family? Like, why aren't their mothers calling? Like, what's going on, right? Like, why
just pop in out of the sky?
It's almost like all their problems are just their own, right? And I say, what is the investment? And I think that is part of the capitalist project. The capitalist project, I believe, is very invested in individuality, right? And individuality is really good for consumption. So if you need something and you don't have a tribe where you could borrow it, you have to get it for yourself, right? And what does that mean if that's how you think it means to be successful, is that you could get everything new and for yourself, versus on truly like being interdependent, right? And sharing resources and all of these things. And I feel like, and I think, it's interesting because I think now, especially around, what we call Corona times, like COVID times, people really have become more interdependent because, especially in New York City, where I am right now, so many people in theater are out of work. Like so many people in the art world are out of work. They're local, so they're getting to know their local. There's a lot of swapping, like a lot of swap, and it's also an environmental movement, right? Where people are like, let's buy less, let's borrow more. Like my trash, your treasure. But I think that's how I grew up as an immigrant, right? One video camera was for everybody. Like, why buy another one? Like, so I think that, yeah, I don't know. I went somewhere else, but
I mean, I think that is also like a defining feature of your work. You know, it is this sort of like position of being an immigrant and of immigrant stories. And it would be interesting, I think, to hear how you think that kind of dovetails in with women's stories, you know, because obviously the experiences of female immigrants will not be the same as the men. And, you know, it's, I think what's interesting about your work is that it carves out a space specifically for those women, you know.
Mm-hmm. I tried in some way to bring in how different the experience of the men were in the 60s in comparison to Anna, and the access they had to the city in a way that Anna didn't have access, you know?
Yeah.
Also, like how they dealt with it, like brothers dealing with it differently because of the color of their skin, right? Like how white can move in a certain way as white presenting like I am versus someone who's dark presenting, what that does to them. And I grew up in a family where this was fact, right? Where colorism was part of everyday life. And how we were aware of it and joked about it and how painful that was.
Yeah. I think we've got another question here about difficulty of finding women and other silenced voices in archives. So do you find that archives at all are helpful when writing about women from Latin America, and what kind of archives do you turn to? I mean, guess the word archive itself is a very sort of like wide-reaching term. So yeah, what do you think?
So, you know, mainstream, so the official archives, right? So for my book, Let It Rain Coffee, I spent some time in the official archives in Santo Domingo.
Wow.
I was interested in learning more about what happened, you know, in the 30s and 60s and, you know, around the Trujillo dictatorship, et cetera. And what I was reading in the history books and the scholarship in the United States was not in the archives in Dominican Republic, right? And so I started looking at newspapers, and if you read Let It Rain Coffee, I have all these newspaper clippings in there from headlines, and I was really interested in how the stories that are become part of the mainstream, including the news that we get fed every day, don't necessarily tell us the entire story. Someone is being erased in that particular story.
Yeah.
So I use them in that way, right? So I would go and think, hey, what is not being said? Why is there no one talking about this? You know, that I know happened because I read about it, right? So one of the things I did, you know, with Dominicana is look at New York Times archives to see anytime Dominicans would get mentioned, and they would get mentioned through baseball, et cetera, or negatively, right? Like through crime, et cetera. And then I say, okay, so what is not being said? This is part. So in some ways, the omissions in the archive excite and propel story. But there's some, you know, I think that, you know, archives are constantly building based on need. And I have to say that my book, Let It Rain Coffee, that has a character who's, you know, Asian, and he's in Dominican Republic. And I went to the archives at the CUNY. There's CUNY City College has a great archive that's focused on Dominican studies and collects all the scholarship being done. Back then in 2005, I went to the librarian and she's like, oh my God, I can't believe she found one article about it. And now there's so many articles, right? So I think that, you know, anytime that anyone feels like, oh, no one is saying this or I can't find it, it's an opportunity to build, right? And that starts to amass all kinds of information, like the Instagram. I can't believe how much stuff is coming to my little Instagram that I started. I call it a little living museum. Because again, like, I think this is happening. There's so many great projects happening on Instagram where people are building archives through crowdsourcing, which is another way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I looked up your Instagram, and I think social media definitely has a role to play, right? In the way that we kind of amass that information, because I think historically there are official records don't sort of give the whole story, and social media, I think, has the power to be a bit of a democratizing force, perhaps, in sort of like, because it's public and anyone can upload, then you're just giving that power back to the people in a sense, I guess. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, I do. I do think that in some ways, again, who gets to tell a story? Very fun when someone sends me a photo and their story, and they'll say, they'll send a photo, it's a great photo, and they'll say, this is my mom, and they'll give her name. She came to America and she became really successful. And I was like, what happened in between? So then and they're not writers, right? So I'll write back and I'll say, well, can you call her and ask, these questions? I'll say, ask these questions. And then they'll come back with new information. They're like, I had no idea. Right. And it's like, oh, this is so wonderful, because it's like the project enables even bridge building or information gathering within families that then transforms the narrative of what they have of their mother, their grandmother, which is very fun and exciting. I highly recommend this.
Okay, if we go into the chat, we've got a question here. It's saying, what writers have inspired you? I think it's interesting, because your books seem to cover a place in the market that, or like give voice to people who haven't always had a voice. It'd be interesting to see what your take on sort of other writers is and who has inspired you.
Well, when I started writing in my early 20s, like the writers that I read a lot of were African American, and they were the most available. I mean, I think we have now it's like a really exciting moment for African American literature in the United States. And so I read a lot of Toni Morrison and Baldwin, and then some Chicana writers, because Chicana writers were the writers that were getting published at that time. So, inspiration, I look for it always. I'm constantly reading. I'm really excited about this moment. There's a book I just, that I've been looking at really, because I'm having a talk with her, Infinite Country. I'm having a talk with her on Wednesday. This is why I have it here, because I'm rereading it. It's beautiful. It's a contemporary novel about a family that immigrates to the United States. So if you like Dominicana, and it's coming out in the UK very soon too. I think it's coming out the next month in the UK. But I love this book because, what I'm interested in is novels that surprise me, right? Like, why read a novel if it's a story you already know or understand, right? And this particular immigration story, it's like, the characters don't do the thing you expect them to do, right? As immigrants. And for me, that's what inspires me. Oh, like this story. Oh my God. Have you guys read The Vegetarian? This must be. Okay. Have you read this?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Look on Natalia. It's so crazy, this book. I love this book. And I'm inspired by women characters that are written that are unexpected, right? And I can't even tell you what this is about, because then I'll ruin the story. I think that there's no way to talk about it
without giving the game away, right?
But I highly, recommend this book,
Sort of like going on from that, someone has asked, from inspiration to the sort of like the future part. So someone has asked, in future works, what are some aspects or themes of your writing that you would like to explore? And were there certain aspects you meant to explore in previous books but weren't given the opportunity? I mean, I guess there's a finite amount of words and sort of like themes you can stick into one book. So there's always going to be that darling little leftover that doesn't actually manage to fit in.
I feel like I have more stories to write than I have time to live. So I feel very lucky, right? Like some people are looking for story. I'm like, the stories are just like assaulting me. I'm trying to finish the book. But I have the book I'm working now that it's coming out, hopefully next year, is called The Immigrant Handbook. And this book, it's really weird how it started, because with Dominicana, oh my God, this book, I love this. Dominicana to me was with me for so long, 14 years. I was like, wow, working on 10 years. I worked on it. And 4 years, I just got rejection after rejection after rejection. And I thought, I'm going to give up writing. What am I doing? Like, I'm writing, I care about what I'm doing. And I went to New York City. I was, living in Pittsburgh at the time because I'm a professor at University of Pittsburgh. And I was in New York City, and everyone was mad at New York City. It was 2017. The trains were breaking down. Everything stunk. No one was picking up the garbage. I don't know what was going on at the time. It was bad. Trump was president. Like that happened, people. Like, we had a moment in the US, depressed. I was like, what? And I was looking into being a lawyer, something more useful, because I was like, I cannot just waste my time when our communities really need our help. Get on the subway, and I see this woman who reminded me a lot of one of my aunts, but also a lot of the women in New York City in 2008 during the Great Recession were unemployed. And they were in their 50s, and they never worked again. And I got to know these women through the interviews I was doing. And I was like, they were like, well, when the factory closed. And I said, did you work again? No, they never worked. They did like informal work, babysitting, they would, but they basically got left out of the job. Even when the country started doing really well, they got left out of the workforce because they had never done an interview. But here I see this woman, and she's like, it's like a book that looked partly ESL, but also had some job interview questions and answers. And I was like, wow, I cannot imagine my aunt at her age going for a job interview. And then I thought, oh, this will be fun. Let me try to answer these questions, these job interview questions. Like, what is your strength? What is your weakness? As if I was my aunt, right? And I did it as an exercise. I got on the subway on my phone, and every time I took the subway, and I only wrote this during the subway, I had to be on a plane, a bus, or train. That was my constraint. I would have her answer a question. And that's where I had Cara Romero, who's my next character, born. She spoke without filter because she didn't know the rules. Right? And it's been really fun. So I think that, in some ways, you never know where the story is going to be born, right? But it happened there. I was like, I'm going to make,
I mean, I guess this is, it can kind of be set off with the smallest thing, and then it just snowballs into sort of like, well, that's the avenue you're going to explore, whether that's sort of like fiction writing or whether that's sort of like research, academic writing. I think that's the way it has a mind of its own almost, and you're just picking up that thread. We've got one more question in the chat here, and it says, did you research the World's Fair when you were writing Dominicana? And if so, did you find many references to the Dominican Republic?
Yeah, I read quite a bit about the World's Fair, only because it was like a big event, it seemed like a big event, and then when I started looking, it's amazing because, it was in 1964, 1965, and back then people thought that by now we would be flying with jetpacks, like we would be able to like what they thought was going to happen by now is not what's happening.
It's like Back to the Future and all that stuff. What happens in sort of like post 2000, it just didn't end up the way they thought it was going to be, shall we say that?
Right. And there was like little inklings of maybe Google or like little inklings of possible technology, like video phone, like whatever, So what I find fascinating is that in some ways, when we think future, we think a lot will change, right? But really the everyday experience of people is not that different. Like, my mother's been living in the same apartment for 50 years. You know what I mean? Like, neighborhood has gentrified, and we might have an iPhone, but the everyday life, she's still going to the same grocery store. The guy still owns it. Like, I was like, wow, like not that much changes, right? We think it changes, like things around us change. And this is also important as we're talking about women, right? Like the civil rights movement was fighting for something. We continue to fight. The statistics are still really bad. Certain things have gotten better, right? Like now you could write a paper, for example, Natalia, and you could put your name on it. 40 years ago, you would have to put your mentor's name on it, right? So that's a big difference, because you can now at least have ownership of your own data, possibly of your own property. Someone's not going to ask for your husband's name, information for you to buy an apartment. Like all these things are good, amazing improvements for our lives, but it's kind of ridiculous that we're still fighting for equal pay. We're still fighting, to be believed when we say we're being assaulted. We're still like, these things to me feel I say, wow, like not that much has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're almost out of time, but I think the last question I wanted to ask you, which kind of ties in with this sort of thing, is, we've had this symposium today to look at different sort of aspects of, women and women's issues. So, sort of like in a nutshell, why do you think it's still important that we are still having these conversations and that we do keep on fighting in a sense?
Well, for example, 2 years ago, I was in Dominican Republic and there was a huge protest because of Black Lives Matter. There's been a huge movement putting pressure on the government to stop deporting Haitians from Dominican Republic. This happened in all countries. I know every country had a protest for whatever immigration issue they had, right? These protests are important. Femicide, Dominican Republic right now is leading on femicides in Latin America and the Caribbean. We're the highest number of femicides are occurring in Dominican Republic. The pressure, the protests, the discussions actually have changed something, because Dominican Republic in November just banned child bride marriages, right?
It's like a huge step.
It's a huge step. Doesn't mean it's going to end. Doesn't mean, right? Because you don't have to legally marry to be forced into a relationship that is problematic. But maybe if they change, discrimination because of gender in hiring practices, if they, create programs where everyone has access to education and go to the university, like free colleges, like all of these come from movements and discussions, and we have to keep the discussions going, because it's the only way things are going to change, truly. Like they're not going to change otherwise. Like, thank God people are protesting on the streets. Like Dominicana got published because of this. If there wasn't a push on publishing to diversify publishing that comes really from the grassroots works that Black women, mostly queer, have been putting on the industry to diversify, there's a lot of the books that we're seeing right now would not have had a chance. I believe this with all my heart. So this is why I keep bringing it up. I keep saying we need to talk about it, because that's the only way change is going to happen.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think we are about at time. I could keep talking to you about these sorts of subjects. Very interesting person to talk to. And, all of these issues, they have so many sort of like ramifications and different sort of avenues that you can go down and talk for hours and hours. But I'd just like to say thank you very much for doing this in conversation with us today, for rounding out our symposium. Thank you to people who have attended and all through the events today. I think, Eleanor, did you want to say anything, my co-organizer, to finish us off?
I am just, hi, Angie. You can't see me right now because my camera is playing up big time, and that's the thing with technology. But listening to you, and also coming from an immigrant family and being an immigrant myself in the UK, it has meant so much listening to you and hear you talk about the craft as well. It was so lovely to hear the question about the omission. And thank you everyone for attending. I just feel like I need to give you a big round of applause for making our evening, our week, and most likely our year as well. So I'm just going to be popping a little message in the chat for everyone else to see. And yeah, that's from me too. Happy International Women's Day.
Yes, happy International Women's Day, everyone.
Hopefully next year in person, right?
Yeah, that would be nice to see actual human beings. But yes, a brilliant way to end off our day. Thank you very much once again, Angie. I think that is about it. So thanks, everybody.